So in this video and ones to follow, we're going to be looking at three things that go hand in hand in hand. That's shading an object, lighting an object, and rendering an object. And it's hard to discuss one without the other because you need to light something to see it, and in order to see it, you've got to render it, and then to define its surface qualities, you've got to put different shaders on it. So we'll deal with these things one at a time, but we'll go around back and forth. So I've got a scan model of Mercury here. This is something nice to work with because rather than just using a simple shape like a sphere, you can see surface detail and how lighting and shading works differently when you have a complex surface. So whenever you bring a new model into Maya, most of the time, unless it's coming from an external application, it's going to come in with the Lambert 1 material. Now you should never change the Lambert 1 material because if you do, every new object that you create in the scene will have that. So if I change the color of the Lambert 1 to green, everything that has this on it, and whenever I create a new object, it will come in with that shader. We don't want that. So you usually just leave Lambert 1 alone. We're going to leave it on here for now. We'll change the shader in a minute. So I'm looking through a shot camera here. I created a new camera to look through. I still have my perspective camera. The quickest way to get to the perspective camera is to hold down spacebar and over where it says Maya here, just left click and go up to perspective view. And then we can navigate around. So I just, super simple scene. I've got a floor. I've got this guy. And I want to start lighting him to see how we can use lights to reveal form in Maya using Arnold. So we'll start with an Arnold area light. You can see my scene is quite small based on the size of the camera relative to this, and this does make a difference in Arnold because it's a physical shader, and so the size of lights and the distance of lights from their subject will influence the quality of the lighting. So I'm just putting this into place, and we can't see what it's doing. If I go into 7 mode, you can see that we should see the lighting in the scene. Now, when you're working with Arnold, I've got this light selected now. You can see it's got an intensity setting and it's got an exposure setting. What we typically do is leave the intensity at 1 and change the exposure. So if I turn this up, you can see that will increase the amount of light that falls into the scene. So we can just work here, excuse me, in the viewport. Now it depends on what kind of video card you have, how well it's going to show this. But you can also open the Arnold render view. Oh, mine's off screen. Click the play button here, and then we can get a representation of what the render looks like. Now you can see this one is actually rendering from my shot cam, even though I'm looking through my perspective cam. So that's good, so I can rotate around, and it will only update the render view here when I make a change in the scene. So if I take this light and I turn the exposure up to 5, then it will change the lighting here. So this is in sort of the position of key light, so most of the object is being lit by this light. Now I can make other lights in the scene to add some backlighting or lighting from another side, or you can change the quality of the lighting by changing its position. So let's say I take this light, I kind of change its position a little bit, and you can see my render view is updating. Now I've noticed sometimes in Maya your left mouse button click turns into a right mouse button click, and it doesn't allow you to grab a handle and move something. If you just switch out from the move tool to the scale tool or something, it usually fixes that. I'm just going to rotate this around. So now you can see it's a light coming from above, and we get a different quality of render here now. So a couple of things to say about this render view here. I've got the settings very low right now, and we'll talk about that in a second, but that's why it's a bit of a dirty render. It's kind of messy looking in here. Under Window, I like to turn on Show Render Tiles. We're not going to see that right now, but it just shows your processor working and where it's working in the scene. But if I grab this light, you can also scale a light and it will change the quality. So if I scale it out like this, you can see there's more light being cast in the scene because it's a bigger light. So it's got more space to cast light, and it's changing the quality of the light too. So if it's a bigger light, you're going to get softer edges, you're going to get softer light. The shadows will be filled in more because some light comes from this part of the light, some comes from this part, it comes from all over. So even when something is mostly in shadow, like under his pecs here, or under his leg, parts of the light will cast some light in here. But the other thing that's happening with Arnold is that by default, it calculates bounced light too. Now, not all renderers do this. Some renderers you have to turn this on as a special setting, but Arnold is a physical renderer, so it's calculating light coming from here, hitting the floor, bouncing back up onto him. That's why we're not getting perfectly dark shadows. And the great thing about Arnold is that it does this, but it does it pretty quickly compared to what some renderers do. So if I take my light and make it much smaller, then you can see that our shadows can be much darker because there's less light that can bounce around into those shadows. So you can make a nice soft light like this, and a model like this that has lots of detail. You get nice sort of occlusion shadows in the folds of this drapery under his what is this? The caduceus stick? Caduceus? I can't remember. So we can change this, and I'm just going to move this back into place here, just more as a key light. You don't have to always light from the upper left. I kind of have a habit of doing that from scientific illustration, but of course you can do whatever you want with the lighting. So that's a little big for the scene. The lighting is nice there. Maybe make it just a bit smaller. Now let's look at the area light attributes. So like I said, we leave the intensity at 1 typically. The exposure is what we can change, but it isn't just, it's more of an exponential growth on the exposure. So going up from 5 to 6 will have less of an effect than going up from 6 to 7 and so on. So the intensity or the exposure ramps up quickly. So I can go to 6. If I go to something like 12, then it's going to be blowing it out. So go to 8. That's even a little too bright. Sometimes it's nicer to have richer lighting by having more than a single light, so we can reduce the amount of light cast by this. And let's say we want to have another light. I can just duplicate this one. Now you can see it's doubled up the light there. But I'm going to move this one kind of back. Behind. Now you don't want to have a key or a fill light like this or a backlight that's too strong, because it just gets rid of all the nice shadows here. Now this still looks pretty good, but you might want to reduce the exposure of this a little bit. If I turn this off, you can see actually that's not really doing much at all now. The exposure is too low. But you can see the backlight can be useful for giving this sort of detail on the edge, like picking up the edge of the form. So this is called a backlight or a kicker light or not a key light, a hair light. It's called a hair light because in news broadcasts these are used to add sort of a halo of light against a newscaster's hair to bring him or her out front of the background a little bit. Anyway, you can, if you want, so you can see this is casting a big shadow in the scene. You can break light links between objects. You can also turn off cast shadows. So for this one, let's change the name of this to backlight. If I turn off cast shadows, then it will get rid of that. But I can also, if I want to, make it not cast a light onto the ground. I can just use it to light this object. And to do something like that, we can go to Windows, Relationship Editors, Light Linking. We can say light centric, so that means the lights will be on this side, and I can choose the backlight and just tell it not to light the floor. So by deselecting something, it's not going to light it anymore. So now we can just use that to just add a little bit of form onto our character here and not have it light the floor. Now this is a little weird because we're faking it, but it's not that realistic anymore. But at the same time, you want to be able to control these things. And with cast shadows turned off, you can see that it's actually lighting places like this, his bicep, which really isn't being normally hit by the light because his body should be blocking that. So we can experiment with turning cast shadows back on again, and you can see it'll just block out that area a little bit. Okay, so a lot of the work you'll be doing will be with area lights. There are some special occasions if you want to make sort of God rays or something where you might want to use a spotlight, or there might be reasons to use spotlights, but in Arnold a lot of the work is done with area lights. But there are other lights to use. But before we get there, let's just continue looking at what the settings for these lights are. So I'm going to turn off the backlight for now, just turn its intensity down to 0. So now we just have the key light, and let me name this key light. Set up here. So key light, we've got the transform node where it's got its position and all this sort of stuff, and the shape node is where we find all the information about it. So let me just turn up its exposure a little bit. So you can change a light shape from a quad to a cylinder to a disc and so on. Typically you just use a quad. It kind of depends on, oops, I think I'm crashing. Hello, sorry about that. Maya crashed on me. So it is a good time to make the point that when you have the Arnold render view open, I'd say you're a little more vulnerable to crashing because it's taxing on the system. And I was switching between light types and it didn't seem to like that. So anyway, just be warned. Maya crashes. All programs crash. Maya seems to enjoy it more than most, but so just be careful. So this isn't exactly the same setup as before, but we'll work with this for now. So we are looking at the attributes of the light. Let's leave the light shape at quad, but know that you can change it, and it will change how it appears in specular reflections, its spread, its resolution. So you can turn this up to have higher quality light in terms of the amount of detail it can capture. But what's a little bit more important is this sample setting here. So let me just get in a little bit closer, and I'm going to change this to my render from the perspective camera. So we'll just get in here. Now this is, I'm playing with fire here too, tempting it to crash. But let's look at some of the shadows that are being cast by this light. And I'm going to set my samples down to 1. Okay, so now you can see that I've got really noisy shadows. If I, now not volume samples, but just the basic samples for the light here. And if we want to save an image in Arnold, we can click on the camera setting and we'll just temporarily save a snapshot. And so now we can change this to 2. picture, and then we can compare. So you can see that adding one extra sample makes a big difference. So what is sampling anyway? If you go to the Solid Angle website, and I'll put a link to this, but they've got a really good page that describes the idea of where noise comes from in a scene and all different types of noise. And so talking about removing noise workflow, and what is sampling. So you can go here and take a look at this, and it gives you an idea of what sampling means. So when you look at an object through the camera, it's got to break it up into small samples of the scene to turn it into a 2D image. And the more samples you have, the more refined it can be. And so here you can see in this example, they're showing a lot of noise here with, and we're talking about camera samples here, but in this case, right now we're talking about light samples, but the idea is the same, that you get better quality images. And here they talk about different types of sampling with bounced light and things like that. So take a moment to look at this to see where sampling comes into effect, and we'll look at some examples in our scene, but this is a really useful resource for understanding what sampling is all about and removing noise, because this is what's going to come up. You're going to make your scenes and start to render them and wonder why things look crummy in some areas. This kind of noisiness that kind of flickers from frame to frame. And this will give you all the answers you need to know about how to do that. And in the next video, we'll talk about sampling. But look at the Arnold or the Solid Angle resource on this. So one type of sampling is in the lights, and we can turn this up to get better quality. Just deselect that. So that's a level 3 sample. So that's 3 to 2 to 1. And one thing to note here is how long it takes to render. Now here it makes very little difference. It says 0 seconds to 1 second. Once your scenes get more complex and you're turning up sampling in different areas to get better quality, then your render times will start to go up and up. And you have to judge what a good balance is, how much time you have to render versus what quality you want to achieve. Okay, so let's go back and continue to look at, turn that off for a second, at the lights. So the lights are visible by default, and you can turn up how much they appear in different parts of the model. So do these lights influence the diffuse color of your model? Let me open up the render view again. And go back to our shot cam. Right, so if I turn this down in diffuse, there's no specular on any of these surfaces. They're all just diffuse. So now this light is casting nothing into diffuse channels, so it turns black. If I turn down specular, it doesn't make a difference because there's no specularity on these shaders. Same with if you don't want this light to influence subsurface scattering. So if you want to control which lights are calculated in subsurface scattering, for example, you can turn that down. Indirect, so if we turn this down, this does make a difference, but kind of a more subtle difference. Excuse me. Now you can see that it falls perfectly into darkness, because with indirect turned down, it means this light is casting no bounced light. So before, light would come from here, hit the ground, bounce up, and fill in these dark areas. So this makes a more dramatic lighting, but you can dial this up and down. So if you want to have a little bit of fill light coming from this light, or a full physical representation of how this light would work at this scale, then you can turn that up. Volume visibility has to do with how it appears in like a fog, a volume fog, which we'll talk about later on. Lastly, you can change the color of a light. And if you're trying to match a scene, you might want to use color temperature rather than this, but for our purposes, usually just changing the color is all we need to do. So that's a primer on using the area light. Next video, we'll come back and look at the sky dome light and how we can use it in interesting ways to create rich lighting in our scene.